All right, welcome to the Stanford D.school. Today's a special day at Masters of Creativity because we're actually broadcasting live from the D.school. There's a lot of you who've never been to the D.school before, so I really quickly wanted to show you in before we get started with our special guest today. I actually just drove in my truck, and as you might imagine, sometimes it has trouble getting up the hill, so you'll forgive me for being a little bit late. But welcome to the D-School. This is our atrium where we honor all of the students that we teach. We teach students from all 7 major schools at Stanford, as well as undergrads. And we are delighted to welcome you here. If you've never been here before, this is the first floor. We can walk into the atrium where a lot of our learning experiences get designed. And the idea here, this is actually the original hitching post of Stanford University. So back in the day, this area was open to the sky. And if you rode your horse onto campus, you would hitch your horse right here. So this is the original kind of meeting place of Stanford D.school, of Stanford University. And now it's the meeting place of the Stanford D.school. So the Masters of Creativity series is a series that spotlights spectacular creative practice across industries and domains. We've had the pleasure of hosting artists and entrepreneurs and authors and inventors and performers and entertainers, all with an eye towards helping us grow in our ability to be even more creative, whatever our area of expertise or the problems we're trying to solve. I'll take you on up to Studio One, where we're going to host the session today. Today, we are joined by Sunkhinder Singh Cassidy, who is a very experienced technology executive, former CEO and founder, who's been involved in lots of companies, as you've seen from her bio. We're excited to join her today, have her join us today at Masters of Creativity, as she's going to be talking to us about her new book called Choose Possibility. And she's going to be speaking specifically about creative mastery through risk mastery. I'm excited to welcome her. I'm going to go stand there. I'll see you in just a second. All right, so welcome to the D-School. We're glad to have you here. We're here in Studio One. This is where a lot of my classes happen at the D-School, and it's where we're hosting from. It's a nice acoustically separate environment. I am thrilled to be joined by my friend Sukhinder. And what we're going to do is Sukhinder is going to introduce some of the key topics of her book. She's going to have all of us take a quick assessment and then work with us to unpack the results and apply them to our daily lives so that we can grow in our creative mastery through learning to master risk better. With that, I'll hand it off to you, Sukhinder. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, first of all, Jeremy, thanks for having me. And can I just say that's the best Zoom intro I've had in a while. So talk about using some creativity. Do you know I have never been to the D-School, even though I've sort of heard about it for so many years and spent a lot of time on Stanford campus. So that was my first tour of the D-School. And I have to say, like, what a fun way to enter this conversation.
Awesome.
So thank you for having me, and I'm really excited to be here. When Jeremy first reached out to me and asked me if I would speak, I thought, I stepped back and thought, like, what do I have to say on this topic of creativity, when it comes to risk taking? And I think for most of us and most of you, it's probably not a surprise that if you were to think about the link between the two, to me, the link is very simple. We do some of our best work when we are unleashed. We do our best and most creative work. We do some of our best problem solving when we are unleashed. Yet one of the things that really holds people back from that is the idea of really taking a risk of anything, an intellectual risk, a creative risk, a physical risk, an emotional risk. These are all the types of things that hold us back. And so when we look at some of the world's most successful entrepreneurs, entertainers, founders, certainly even CEOs, all of these roles require creativity and creative problem solving. And I would say almost every leader I know in any field has to sort of figure out how and when they are willing to put themselves at risk. And so kind of, when I thought about that link, I got more and more excited about coming to chat with you all and really applying some of the things around risk taking and helping you unpack risk taking so maybe you can unleash some of that own creative power for yourself, whether it's creative problem solving or just sheer creativity in the artistic sense, or in the business sense, whatever it is. If I can help you unlock it today, then we've done something positive together. But I'm going to start with a story because I think that nothing helps us understand what risk is better than a story, right? When I was growing up, I grew up in a household with two doctors. My parents were both immigrants who came to Canada late in their life. I don't think anybody would really think about doctors as sort of people who are kind of risk-taking masters. Most people would say, indeed, maybe medicine is a path to helping people, but with a rather stable income. And I can certainly tell you that my mom, when I was growing up, would have loved nothing better than for her daughter to become a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer, thinking of them as rather safe professions. But I think, my first introduction to risk taking really came growing up with my family. And yes, my parents took one big risk. They left behind an entire life in Africa and moved to Canada when they were relatively late in their life to give us a better education, and they started over. So they took financial risk to do that. But outside of that, we lived in a small town. My parents saved money. They were financially successful, and they would go to work every day and see patients and had a lot of predictability to their life. Yet, I think all of my early lessons in risk taking came from my father, and there are a few reasons for that. Number one, I think what I observed about entrepreneurship was that it wasn't this sort of big one swing for the fences that the Valley often kind of creates myths around. If I'm living in a place like Silicon Valley and hearing the stories outside in, it's really easy to imagine entrepreneurship as one mighty choice, one risk filled gamble that gets you where you need to go. Yet, what I observed about entrepreneurship from my father, like what entrepreneurship? I'm like, my parents ran a medical practice. My father considered himself a business person and he loved business as much as he loved practicing medicine. And so I would watch him every day take little swings, medium sized swings, big swings. A little swing might be something as like, should I hire another employee, right? A medium sized swing was, should I like literally try and create a name for the business I imagined? My father actually named his practice the Healthcare Service Center because he dreamed of building a walk-in clinic. So he actually just created a brand name for it. I mean, I don't think really in the 1970s people were thinking about medical practices as brand names, certainly not sole proprietors. And then something as big as buying a building because he imagined actually literally running a 24/7 walk-in clinic and employing other doctors and taking financial risk in order to create a business out of his practice of medicine. By the way, that dream was never fully achieved. He bought a building, probably never had more than two or three doctors in it, created the brand, opened his doors up. People would walk in off the streets. But my experience of entrepreneurship was it was multiple swings, some micro, some macro, always kind of aiming at the next possibility. And that like worldview of risk, I don't think I really appreciated how valuable it was until, I grew up and started taking risks myself. So my first kind of point to all of you before kind of we unpack what risk taking means for you is, if you were to sort of think of debunking one myth around risk taking, it would be this single one. If you perceive taking risk as a single mighty swing, right, with abject success or utter success, glorious success, or abject failure on the other end, that might be the most risky way to think about mastering risk. Let me say that again. If you're aiming for a single mighty swing, I would say that is probably the most, risky way to create a relationship with risk. So before we go any further, what we're going to do is we're going to have you all step back and evaluate the role risk plays in your own life today. And I'm going to have you all take a little quiz. So I'm going to share a screen here. And I promise this will just take a couple minutes. Can everybody see this? I'm just trying to move my screen here.
Yep,
If
looks
you
great.
could all take your phones out, we're going to give you a couple minutes. And I want you to go to choosepossibility.com/risk-quiz and just take 2 or 3 minutes out and go ahead and figure out what kind of a risk taker you are today in your life. All right, as you're taking the risk quiz, I probably shouldn't make you too much longer. But as you take it, the next thing I'm going to ask you to do is pretty simple, which is once you have your results, go to slido.com. You can just, Use your phone to scan this QR code and enter your results. All right, I'm going to start to watch the results as people start to finish up their quiz. So let's see what we've got here. Like, what is this amalgamation of people we have on the phone? Move this over here. And how do you all think about risk taking? By the way, just there is no wrong answer, which we'll come to in a moment. We'll give it a few more minutes. We've got 177 people on the phone, so let's try and get to 50 or 60 results, which I think will be a good sample size of the folks we have on the phone.
Sukhinder, maybe I'll ask you, what's your style?
Oh, Jeremy.
Is it too early?
To reveal it, it's a little early, I promise.
All right. I respect
I'm gonna
that.
come there very soon, but I want to I want to make sure I don't bias the results.
I got you. I don't want to mess with the process.
I'm going to ask you the same question.
All right, deal.
All right, it's interesting. The polls moving here. We're at 16. I'm surprised we have no critics on the phone. Critics play a very valuable role when it comes to risk taking. We're going to talk about that. All right, we're at 21 results. I don't want to hold us up too much longer, so I'm going to give it. We may not get all the way to 50. I hope we do, but if not, we'll call it in just a couple minutes. Either we've got really shy people, or the quiz took longer than I thought. Mostly, it should be pretty easy.
Oh, these folks aren't shy. Definitely not. I know.
There you go.
This is like our 17th session. People, I know you're not shy. And they've learned to use QR codes as well through these sessions. So hopefully it's not tech.
Well, now I'm going to tell you what I am, but more importantly, I'm going to describe all of these styles. So I'm a calculator, which it looks like is a trait I share with many people on the phone. But the most interesting thing is, first and foremost, just so you all know, the population that is describing itself on the phone is pretty different from the average results of the U.S. population. So when we first created the quiz, we obviously launched a sample across the United States so we could get a good picture of what does the average population look like. And what do people think that the predominant style is for the population at large? Any guesses? Jeremy, what's your guess?
I would say contemplator.
And you would be right. So the contemplator and the calculator, by the way, are not that different. If you know many high-achieving folks who are plenty ambitious and get a lot done, they might well be a contemplator. Don't be so sure that they're all calculators. So let's describe the contemplator. The contemplator is somebody who wants to make a good decision, who can easily weigh the pros and cons of any situation. The contemplator and calculator probably both pull out pieces of paper and do their pros and cons list, whenever it comes time to make a key choice. They're probably both quite high achieving in terms of their capacity to make a smart choice. But the difference is, when asked, a contemplator will say, if I had one struggle, it's indecision, and if I had one regret, it's the choice not made. Whereas a calculator might say, nothing drives me crazier than no decision at all. I cannot stand the thought of not making a decision. So on paper, these people look very similar, but what drives them crazy and their regret sources are different. Now, change seeker is one of the least popular archetypes in the U.S. population, yet here it's a number 2, right? And so a change seeker is somebody who's obviously quite comfortable making new choices. Sometimes you think of this person as sort of never having FOMO because, FOMO, they don't let FOMO take over their life. FOMO is the thing that keeps them acting, i.e. they don't want to miss a new experience. And so they are willing to take more choices, make more, make more decisions, and try things that are new, relatively speaking, often. But what's the risk for a change seeker? Anybody know what's the risk for a change seeker? If you have an idea, just throw it into chat. I'm going to take a look here and see if we can find it. Any ideas of what a change seeker does? Making bad choices, sabotaging yourself, job hopper, random, lack of commitment. You guys got it. So what's the real risk with making too many choices? Isn't the real risk that you move laterally throughout your life, trying a lot of things, blowing things up, hasty decisions, don't finish anything, right? This is the risk of a change seeker. Like, are you making forward progress, or are you changing for change's sake? And then, thank you guys on the chat. I'm going to keep the chat window open. And then we have no critics on the phone. But let me just ask you, the critic is a pretty popular archetype in the US population. What do you think are the positives of being a critic when it comes to being a risk taker? I know 0 critics is like, I'm shocked actually, but you're all, yeah, somebody's calling it. So yes, the critic is a challenger. What is a critic really good at? Anticipating problems, you nailed it. What else? Do critics create stable environments? Oh, maybe refresh, because I see 4% critics. Good idea. I'm going to refresh right now. Let's do this again and see if critics have rose. Black hat thinking, sadness. Critics bring opposing perspectives. You guys nailed it. Let's just go to show the results again. It's interesting. It's so interesting that critics are not showing up for me. But you guys hit it. Like, critics are very necessary thinkers in the risk-taking process, because if any of you think that the key to taking risk is doing so naively with a view that's always optimistic, I have something to sell you. Buy the junker at the back of my house, because I tell you, it works like a charm. All right, so we're going to shut down the quiz, but the one other thing I really want to do before I ask you to think about how the relationship you have with risk in your own life is identify the other things that kind of might be holding you back. So the reason I always like starting with the risk quiz is very simple. It's very hard to make any change in our lives if we don't know our starting point, right? But the way in which we interact with risk, even those who are calculators among us, still has opportunity for optimizing. And that's because most of us suffer, myself included, by the way, at any point in time from one of these 6 different myths that surround risk-taking. So I talked about the first one, this idea that, of the myth of the single choice. When I wrote the book, one of the reasons I actually wrote the book, the primary reason, is because this myth, number 1, was driving me crazy. For the last 10 years of my career, as I kind of had some level of kind of maybe visible success, people would often ask me, like, Sukhinder, what's the thing you did? What did you do to be successful? And most times I want to say to people, like, you think it's one thing? What if I told you that mostly what I did was hang on? Like, mostly what I did was keep choosing through success and choosing through failure. In fact, I mapped sort of my own career journey, and I made 23 different choices throughout my career. 23 different choices. And if I were to show you the correlation between any single choice and any single result, I would tell you it would not look linear at all. The linearity or the probability or the predictability of risk and reward emerged over multiple choices. Some big, some small, some that led to outsized outcomes, some that led to no outcomes, some that led to failing outcomes. So I wrote the book because everybody sort of who thinks about risk from afar presumes it's a single choice. And risk is not a single choice game. If you want to unlock the value of risk taking, you do it by practicing risk as a muscle. Risk is something you try and master by practicing it over and over again. So that's sort of why I wrote the book. But in the writing of the book, it was very clear that 5 other myths really keep us paralyzed in ways that we can't imagine. So I'm going to go back to the chat because it's sort of fun for me to see. What do you think is the myth of Mother Nature? What's the myth I'm talking about when I say to folks, hey, here's another, risk-associated myth that might be holding you back? What do people think is the myth of Mother Nature? Any guesses? Genetic predisposition. You nailed it. Nature versus nurture. Many of you might have thought, hey, risk takers are born that way. There are people who are naturally predisposed to take risk. because we presume that when we see people who take a lot of risk, that they are fearless. But the reality, again, is nothing could be further from the truth. The average person who is taking a risk and doing it repeatedly is not fearless. They are actually optimizing two fears. They are optimizing two fears that you may not realize, are at war with each other when we're trying to decide whether to take action on any particular choice. What's probably familiar to all of you is FOMO, the fear of missing out, right? And in fact, many schools of sort of academics, research will say like visualization of the positive is so essential to reaching a goal, right? This is sort of maximizing your FOMO. You keep imagining all the amazing things that will happen if you make a choice, right? In order to increase your FOMO. If you increase your fear of missing out enough, you're like, hey, I'll act. If I can just visualize enough, all of the amazing things are going to be on the other side, I'll act. Okay, that's fear number one. But the other fear that everybody is mastering, everybody, is fear of failure, right? What I call FOF. So fear of failure, is sort of very simple, the fear that we will abjectly kind of lose in making a choice. So if you think about risk mastery, right? Risk mastery is really an equation. If your FOMO is greater than your fear of failure, you'll act. And if your fear of failure is greater than your FOMO, you will fail to act, right? Make sense? Everybody get that? Right? FOF versus FOMO. Okay, so again, classic wisdom would suggest to you that the way to get into action is to ramp your FOMO. But does ramping your FOMO do anything to conquer your fear of failure? You can ramp your FOMO, but if your fear of failure is still bigger than your FOMO, you'll fail to act, right? This is why risk mastery is about managing actively two fears. So how many of you know the name Alan Eustace? Any of you know a gentleman by the name of Alan Eustace? If you do, write yes in the chat. If you don't, just write no. All right, so most people don't know Alan. It's no surprise. Alan was a colleague of mine at Google for many years when I was running Asia Pacific and Latin America from 2004 to 2009. Alan was the vice president of engineering globally for Google. Somebody right now is going to go Google Alan Eustace's name, and we're going to come to it in just a moment. But Alan was the VP of engineering. I was the VP of Asia Pacific and Latin America. We worked together. We opened R&D centers around the world. We lobbied Google to open China's, our original entry into China, all of these things. And if you met Alan, you'd notice he looks like a lot of other engineers, bespectacled, kind, quiet, very academic, very smart. And in 2011, as I had already left Google, Alan decided to take a sabbatical because he was dreaming of building a flying suit for humans. So one of his interesting scientific pursuits was like, wow, can I build a man-made suit in which people can fly? So we went to Google, and in typical fashion, Google provides sabbaticals for those who've been there a long time. Alan took a sabbatical. Over the years, Alan's dream morphed. And it morphed from building a flying suit to Alan is Iron Man. Others are saying yes. Alan morphed from building a suit to deciding that he wanted to build something that could take him up into space, and he wanted to attempt the largest free fall from space ever done, the longest skydive in human history. So Alan began designing a way, which is very appropriate for the D-school, a system to take him to the edge of the stratosphere, and then parachute him down from space to Earth, and do the longest kind of free fall and fastest free fall from space to Earth. So you say to yourself, well, gosh, if he wants to get into action, do you think Alan's main criteria or way of getting into action was ramping his FOMO? What do you think? No, Alan did just the opposite. He embraced design to think about every single failure path on his, path to being sort of a world record holder in jumping from space. And over the ensuing years, Alan tested every failure case of his system, his suit. He ultimately created a hot air balloon system to take him up to the edge of the stratosphere. Such that by the time Alan attempted this free fall from space, and quite frankly, the only other person who'd ever done it, a gentleman I think by the name of Baumgartner, was truly a world-class skydiver. Alan had never done any skydiving. By the time Alan climbed out of that basket, like literally a balloon that took him into space, into the stratosphere, and fell 25 miles to Earth, setting the world record for the longest free fall from space, Alan's heartbeat remained constant and in line with his resting heart rate. So, pretty crazy story. But if I were to say to you, well, how did Alan take the ultimate risk? He did not do it by ramping his FOMO. He did it by mastering his fear of failure. And getting himself enough to a place where he felt like his fear of failure was de minimis enough that he could actually pursue, that ambition and hurdle himself from space to Earth. So when we think about people as being fearless, I tell you, the world's best risk takers are actively managing both FOMO and fear of failure. And fear of failure not by avoidance, but by confronting the failure states and thinking about the choices after the choice. If you made a failing choice, what would you do? They are pre-morteming, the choices available to them should the first move fail, including Alan, in order to finally get into action. All right, let's move to a few other myths that might be holding you back, because when we wrap up, I'm going to ask you to think about which of these myths apply to you, and then think about the little risks you might want to take to start debunking these myths for yourself. What about the myth of stability? When I say there's a myth around stability, what do I mean? Looking into the chat to see who is the answer. Time risk, yeah, that's one. Just staying still. What other things might I mean by the myth of stability? Losing things, safety, boom, you hit it. The myth of stability is the myth that staying still is safe, right? Then we're like, well, gosh, like if it's like dangerous to act, I might as well just stay still. Like if I stay still, I'm safe. But is staying still safe? Well, there's a lot of data around this as well. So when it comes to humans, the World Economic Forum suggests that every 5 years, the value of any single skill we have diminishes and degrades by 50%. So if you just stay still, my friends, like your skills will degrade at a rate of 50% every 5 years while other people's skills are advancing. So that stability is not safe at the individual level, at least when it comes to sort of, keeping up with the Joneses who are, all the people around us whose skills keep advancing. Even at a company level, that's not true. So one of my favorite business books is a book called Strategy Beyond the Hockey Stick from McKinsey. And it's sort of like the new good to great. It studies over 30 years what creates non-linear performance, outperformance on an enduring basis in great companies. And it finds that companies that stay stagnant, are more likely to fail than companies that make multiple moves, including failing moves, right? So the path to success requires multiple moves and almost certainly means failing moves in proportion to winning moves in order to be an overall and outsized winner. But for a company to fail over a 30-year period is to stay stagnant and to make no moves at all, including failing moves. All right, let's come to the 3 other myths that are likely, playing some role in your current relationship with risk-taking. The myth of control. So, what do you think I mean by when I say there's a myth of control? That we all have a myth of control. Anybody know? Known unknowns, yeah. Results can be predicted. Staying in power. Control is also safe. All right, my friends, you're hitting it. So the myth of control is this myth that the outcome of any situation is inherently within our control. Right? We all operate saying, gosh, I need to make this choice. If I make this choice and I work hard enough, it's going to be successful, right? And if I fail to perfectly execute, I will fail. It's as if we think, the world is subject, any choice is subject only to our control and actions in determining outcomes that are successful or failing. Now, there are somebody said here, knowns and unknowns. Interestingly, risk itself falls into 2 kinds of risks. There are what we call subway risks and what we call coconut risks. Subway risks are the types of risks we can predict, like choices that have some known volatility. Researchers call it subway risk when they say, gosh, what's the risk that the subway arrives at 7:58 versus 8:03 for an 8 o'clock subway train? The risk that there's some known volatility in a train's arrival at the station. So if you can predict that, you can anticipate it and decide if you're going to go to the station at 7:57 or at 8:02, right? So we all want to be better predictors of subway risk, right? There's like volatility that's controllable around us, and we sort of say, hey, gosh, I can anticipate and react to that volatility. Now there's what we call coconut risk. Coconut risk is literally the risk that a coconut will drop out of a tree, hit your head, and kill you. That's why researchers call it coconut risk, because it can't really be anticipated, right? COVID, by and large, was a coconut type risk, right? Black swan events we think will never happen in our lifetime, and they do, right? This is an example of something that is wildly out of your control. You can't anticipate it. But whether it's coconut risk or whether it's subway-sized risk, our job is not to sort of secede control of our lives, but it's to be in an anticipatory and response scenario with, when we're watching the environment around us. And the best risk takers in the world, well, they don't really think that it's all about them. They think it's all about them in concert with their environment. And they're always trying to assess what is going on and finding the tailwinds in their environment, the positive factors that might increase the probabilities of success, or identifying the headwinds and how they might respond. So the best risk takers actually are trying to do one thing that other people don't try and do. They don't presume they can control it all. They want to be finding the things in their environment that can accelerate their chances of success. Now in tech, there's a saying among venture capitalists, between great leaders and poor markets win. Meaning you could have the best idea in the world, but if the timing is wrong for it, you won't necessarily succeed. By the way, I've had at least 2 companies I built that were many years too early. One was Utley, a fintech leader that actually managed to survive and go public. The other was Joyous, which was a company I started in video commerce 10 years before, the arrival of TikTok video, Snapchat video, Instagram video, Google video. And I can tell you, like, no amount of my execution could force the customer to, adopt a new technology early. So what you want to be doing as a risk taker is thinking about how you act dynamically in response with your environment and how you anticipate the things that can help accelerate your chances of success versus those that might diminish them, and what you might do in return. The myth of passion. This is another risk-taking myth that I think is a pretty fascinating one. I'm gonna, in the spirit of going a little quicker here, I'm gonna tell you what it is. It's pretty obvious. We're often told that if we're going to make a choice, or we're going to take a risk, let's take a risk in the direction of passion. Let's just choose the things we're most passionate about, right? So this myth of passion is like, hey, a smart risk taker, makes choices, in and around their passion. But let me tell you something. Passions, unfortunately, are not static. Many of us don't know what our passions are. If I said, hey, make a passionate choice today, many people are like, well, I'm not really sure what I'm passionate about. Often it takes actually, practicing and acting and trying new things before we can even figure out what we're passionate about. So if I told you a smarter risk to take would not be one that pursues your passion, I would tell you that the smarter risk to take might be one that pursues working with people who can teach you a lot and optimize your chances of success. So I often say to people, if you're thinking about being a smarter risk taker, don't be so sure that you should be choosing the what. Maybe the active choosing you want to do is around the who. Now people say, well, what do you mean by that? I'm like, well, if you think again about increasing the probability of something being an impactful or successful outcome, who we work with, sometimes predicates whether or not we'll do our most creative work, our best work, be in a place where we feel included and safe, be in an environment that unleashes our passion. That is often dictated by who we work with as much as what we work on. Maybe maybe you've known since you were born that, music was your passion. Unfortunately for me, I've had many passions in my lifetime. But following the risk-taking paradigm of putting myself in situations where who I work with can unleash my creativity, and make me feel safe to take risk has always been one of the smartest bets I can make. And then lastly, the one last myth I want to debunk is this, and let me move this over here, and let me move this over here so you can see it, is the myth of risk and reward. So if you're one of these people who thinks that the myth, that the kind of the reward for risk is the reward you imagined, well, again, I'm sorry to tell you that that might not be the right framing for risk and reward when you think about the next move you want to make. If you think all the way back to the beginning, I identified that when we make a choice and we imagine a reward, we have the single choice, single paradigm reward mindset. But would everyone agree that if you want to kind of achieve a big reward, it's often something that's maybe 2, 3, 5 years away? So once you sort of choose to pursue that goal, what stands between you and that ultimate reward? How many more choices do you need to make? 1, unlikely. 10, maybe. 100, very likely. And you're about to enter a risk-reward paradigm where every day you are making smaller choices to try and unlock a smaller outcome, a smaller impact, a smaller learning today. And only when you've accumulated a number of choices and a number of risks and outcomes, and each outcome is really trying to drive impact today, will they accumulate enough to be or not to be the reward you originally imagined. But that process of every day pursuing a smaller choice in order to unlock incremental impact, then another choice, then another impact, then another choice. By the way, not all impacts are positive. Sometimes they're negative results, but learnings, which are very useful and impactful when you think about making your next choice. You're in a constant kind of risk, impact, risk, impact, risk, impact virtuous cycle until you do or do not get the ultimate reward. But the benefit of that risk reward cycle or that risk impact cycle is you build the kind of career capital that people crave. You build agility, you build resilience, you build confidence. Once you know you can make a choice, create an impact, and get the result, positive or negative, and choose again, you are empowered. That is the definition of empowerment, that you know that you can create impacts in learning. And that virtuous cycle is probably the best predictor of long-term success in your ability to unlock cumulative reward. So if you think the reward for risk is the original reward, it's not. But it is agility, confidence, resilience, and an amount of smaller impacts, whether or not they added up to the one you originally imagined, all of which are what I call your career capital. All of these impacts define who you are and your ability to move through the world far more than the original reward you imagined. So with that, I'm going to wrap up. And before we go to Q&A, hopefully this has given you guys all a framework to think about which myths might be, holding you back as you think about, first of all, your natural risk-taking style, and then, the choices you might make. And, as we leave here today, I know we're going to do some Q&A. I think it would be great for each of you to pull out a piece of paper when we're done. Think about these 6 myths. Identify the 1 or 2 that are really holding you back. And then I want you to, identify on the other side, not just the biggest risks you could take to unlock reward or the biggest risks you might be dreaming of taking, but I want you to identify the little risks, the littlest risks you could take to unlock more impact today. Because I can guarantee that the accumulation of little risks versus sort of one big risk, are in and of themselves part of the myth we want to debunk. And if you leave with nothing else but saying, hey, I'm going to take 5 more little risks, you will be on the path to unlock the cumulative rewards you seek. So with that, Jeremy, I'm going to turn it back to you, and you can let me know if there are questions from the audience that I can answer as we come into our time together.
I would just start, one of the questions that really resonated with me as I read it is, you mentioned how the who is even more important than the what, or the people you're working with is more important than passion. Mm-hmm. How do you gauge that? If you're, and I can't remember who asked it, but someone asked about the interview process. And I can see that actually playing both ways. If I'm a prospective employee seeking to join a new organization, how do I gauge the who aspect relative to the what? And then I think conversely, for a lot of folks here who are leaders, who are hiring people, how do they gauge the who when it comes to optimizing for who you're working with rather than, the particular passion, so to speak?
Got it. Well, first of all, there's the good news is there's actually a lot of research on the who. In my book, I talk about another book that's written called Super Bosses, which is how do you identify people who disproportionately, drive impact and success. And like, let's identify a few different kind of things about who. First of all, even super bosses would tell you, like, very few look the same. Like, it's not like they have an archetype where like somebody's like they're all extroverts, or they're like, super bosses are very different, but there's some things they do incredibly well, and you can look, you can identify these. By the way, we live in a world, as you know now, that even when you're interviewing forward, or when you're checking on Glassdoor, or when you're checking on LinkedIn, you can pretty much understand what somebody might be like to work with, both in the forward interview process as well as back channel. Here's what the types of things that super bosses do well. They mentor or coach. That's one style. Number two, they attract other talent. So you are in an environment where you are learning by osmosis. Super bosses often have an abundance of opportunity because they're masters of their craft, right? So, simply being in proximity to them, you actually get an offshoot of opportunity, right? Super bosses might challenge you. So super bosses are people who will accelerate your learning path, but don't presume that that's all like nice and fuzzy. It might be, it might not be. Super bosses have very different styles, right? But if you think that you will be in an environment of accelerated learning because they're challenging, coaching, drawing the type of people around you where you look at the team, you're like, wow, look at the quality of the people I get to work with. Or quite frankly, just like dispersing so much opportunity because, they themselves are receiving so much opportunity and dispersing it to others. These are all characteristics. Now, there's one other really important characteristic, as you all know, which is values fit, right? So I've often said what we really seek are people who are heterogeneous to us in terms of their styles, their skills, their knowledge, their capabilities, yet we all want to be in trusted and safe environments. So what we're looking for is sort of at the level below, we're looking for values overlap, right? And by values overlap, we mean like, generally is my sense that this person has a similar feeling of like what's just and fair and like good in the world. Like that's no other way to describe it, right? Like you have a sensibility. And so like people say, well, how do you test for values? Interestingly, sometimes just asking people like, you can be like, hey, what are you like, what are your values? Like when things get tough, give me an example when, something got really tough in this group. How did you guys all handle it? What were you most proud of, and how you handled it? What was challenging about you, how you handled it? Like asking questions like that are the types of things that reveal values. I mean, I've been in conversation when I say to somebody like, what are your values? And people say to me like, what are my values? And I will say like, hey, one of my values is authenticity. I want like what you see is what you get. I want to give that to people. I want that back. Like when I find myself working with people who, let's say, are passive aggressive, that's very hard for me because I don't know what they're thinking and like, right. And because one of my values is authenticity or candor, I want to offer that to other people, right? But I'm also clear with people like, I'm clear with people on what I'm not great at and what I'm great at because I'm looking for my compliments too. I'm looking for the people who make me better as a leader or as a partner to them by being honest about what I'm great at and what I'm not. But I'm also looking for people with whom I feel safe, right? So I can be seen. So I think those are the types of things that are important. And as I said, like often asking how people deal with difficult situations, how the team dealt with difficult situations, like those are the types of way you want to asking people outright, like what are the 2 or 3 things that are your values? So like, I'm just curious and be prepared to answer the same thing in return. Like it's okay, right? Because ultimately you're going to do your best and most creative work, when you're in a situation where you're very proximate with those things, and you're going to do your best learning when you're in the company of super bosses.
That's a great hack, I think, for both folks who are interviewing and also for folks who are looking to add members to their team. Hey, a totally different diversion. I think one of the things that we all can agree on is the importance of the next generation and youth. And there are a number of educators who join these sessions, but then many of us are also parents as well. And I really resonate with the question that Mark Chun asked. He said, what have you observed about schools or our education system in general that reinforces some of these myths in young people? And I might add the co-joiner to that. What about parenting styles reinforces these myths? And to say it differently, is there a way that we can short circuit some of these myths either at home or in the school environment?
Yeah, well, first of all, and I'm as guilty as the rest, right? I think if you think about what myths hold schools back and maybe hold parents back, is like this myth of safety and control, is a myth that probably kind of exists, right? So, um, like let's think of many good examples, right? Like structure is safe, right? So none of us want our children to be completely unstructured. Yet it's hard to be creative when all you do want to do is give people sort of like all the lines in which to paint, right? So how do you create creative problem solvers when like our like core desire is to give our children structure and safety? So
Mhm.
I think this is actually a challenge. I mean, and I always say to people, I don't know that I have it right, but one of the things I've learned as a CEO, which I wish I did better as a mom. I don't, but I wish I did. So don't think I'm the best at this, certainly. It comes easier to me at work because I know I'm there to develop people, where at home I want to do is like keep my kids safe, right?
Right.
Uh, but when I'm at work, I've realized that if I want people to take risk at work, going in as a CEO and saying to your leadership team, "Hey, here's a blank sheet of paper, take some risk." Good luck with that strategy, because people want to know if it can be successful even when they're taking risks, right? So first of all, you have to say like, what are the parameters you give people in which to give them some structure, but not so much structure that they don't exercise their own creativity. So as a CEO, as an example, I found that when I put my smart leadership team in a room and I'm like, "Hey, yeah, I want you guys to do the strategy." Guess what? They're going to keep meeting and meeting and meeting and debating because I've given them no structure in which to be creative, right? I haven't reduced the risk enough. Do you know what I mean? Their fear of failure is so high that they're just throwing everything on the wall. But I'm like, but that's not actually what I'm looking for. So as an example, as a CEO, I'm like, I want to time bound it. Might want to name a facilitator. I want to give them a task. I want to give them a framework that says like, hey, I'm looking for like no more than one page. I'm looking for your roughest thinking. I'm looking for a range of outcomes. Please don't come back and give me perfect with, which it can't possibly be. So I think when we as parents and as educators ask for perfect, we are giving our children sort of another challenge. So I think there's this challenge of like giving people too much structure, but you want to give them some. And I think there's also the challenge of like expecting perfection. People think that perfect is what somebody wants back. And by the way, schools do train that, right? Like A plus, A minus, like, 24 out of 25, 25 out of 25. So I think schools actually train perfect. I think bosses sometimes train perfect. I think planning processes train perfect. And like perfect is not risk taking, right? Perfect is like, hey, I want you to identify all the possible solutions. Tell me the one you're recommending and why. And I'm not going to hold you to a standard that if you fail, you failed. Like if you came to me with a hypothesis and something well thought out and a recommendation, what I want to know then is that you can pivot. So I think like teaching our children how to pivot and so on, like I don't know that I'm good at it either, because I think that, my son comes home from school and I'm still a person who's like, got 23 out of 25, like, you got to see, you need to do a retake. Like school is reinforcing some of this. But I think all of these, and this is what I love about the D school, like, design thinking is what we need with our children. It's what we need, in schools. It's like, but, I'm sure you would say, Jeremy, there's systems for design thinking. You don't just say to people, design.
Right.
You give
Right.
people systems in which to sort of exercise their free creativity, but still feel safe. That's sort of what I think is needed, but I'm not perfect at it by any means.
Sukhinder, the question is, if you want to increase your risk, yet work feels like a tough place to do it, what advice do you have if work is a difficult place to take risks?
Well, first of all, I think your first question is to figure out why is it a difficult place to take risk and diagnose, is it the environment, and as I said, or is it you, or is it both, right? So, and one of the ways to know that, by the way, is to start taking little risks at work and see what happens, right? So when people say work is tough, what you want to identify is what is tough about it. Is it that you're the most unsafe situation for people is when there's no values overlap. Like you don't trust that you have a similar worldview of what's fair and good and just, right? So if you think generally speaking, your workplace doesn't need to be perfect, but if you don't think it's fair as an example, you're unlikely to take risk at work, right? Like if right. So but let's say one up from values overlap is like, you're like, hey, I think these people share similar values, but I'm still scared to take it. Then you've got to figure out, is it, relationship, what about your manager, might make you feel like it's unsafe? Or is it your own fear of failure and your own ego. I will tell you that in the book, I mean, we didn't go through it today, I help people identify what are the different types of fears they have. And typically it's, financial fear, ego fear, or personal fear. Like these are three types of risk.
Mm.
Most often what holds us back from taking a risk today is ego risk. It's our own sense of if I put it out there and it fails, what happens? So I can't tell you if that's what's going on for you at work. That's hard for me to say. But I think you want to evaluate what in the environment makes you feel unsafe to take risk. And if you can't quite identify it, then I would say you should identify what about yourself is holding back. Is it ego risk? And I will say to people, like, think through the failure state. Like, I'm a big believer in, like, one of the reasons I take a lot of little risks is because I believe I can live with the failure state. The failure risk state is I look like an idiot. Okay, whatever. Like, there's no harm that's really going to come from that. So I'm happy to keep taking little risks because I recognize that what's holding me back is my own ego, right? Oh, by the way, on big risks, of course I worry about ego. Like, of course I worry if I'm going to fail as a CEO or what have you. But in terms of this daily practice of risk taking, often it's our egos. And if it's not, I want you to identify, for the person who's thinking, ask the question, what in your environment is making you feel unsafe? And how much of it is your own ego?
I love that point. I just want to double click on it because I think it's so worthwhile. It's the implied frame of reference there that work is tough. So what should I do? Implies, I think where it's easy to think is, where else can I take a risk? And what you just said is actually assess, why is it that assumption is being made? What is it about the environment? What is it about what it's stirring up in you? What is it revealing about you? I think that's an exceptional way to introspect and to assess before assuming, because it's really easy to say, I want to be a risk taker, I just can't do it here. And I think what you just said, you just kind of batted the ball back over the net. You said, well, why? Rather than, granted, you can't do it here, here's all the other places you can take risks.
And I was also say, look, people are very binary in their thinking. It's big risk or no risk. I'm like, no, think incrementally. What's the little risk you could take to test your way into the bigger risks?
Yeah.
So if you don't want to have a conversation with your boss about, I don't know, quitting your job, what's a conversation you can have about, like, what's not feeling satisfactory today? What would you like to try that's different? That's a little risk.
I heard you say a word that I don't think you'd mentioned before. I know there's only 2 minutes left. So people, this is a teaser, drop off if you have to, but I know that one of your core beliefs is around daily risk taking. I don't think you'd mentioned that before, just this little tidbit right now. Say a couple words about taking small risks every day.
So I think hopefully from this conversation, you've got that I'm not a believer in like the one mighty risk philosophy. I think you'll take risks of different sizes in your lifetime. But I'm a big believer in that virtuous cycle, which is there's no big outcome without a bunch of little outcomes. It's just impossible. It's impossible. It's impossible that some big reward happens without having created numerous smaller outcomes beforehand. What's the key to a smaller outcome? Taking a little risk today. What's the key to accepting failure? Taking a little risk today. What's a real, why does Steph Curry still make, on average, I don't know how many threes? Despite he may go a game where he makes like no threes, it doesn't matter. He just keeps taking the shot, because he's inuring himself to failure, and he's increasing the overall probability that he's going to be the best 3-point shooter in the world and in history just by taking the shot again and again and again. So think about little risk taking as your path to risk mastery, and also to increasing the probabilities of success overall.